Welcome everybody to the miniature machining workshop. The topic of this movie is the repair of a fan, as you can see on the left hand side. So what I've actually got here is one fan that's together, and I've got a second fan that I've taken apart. Very commonly with these types of fan, the reason why they stop working is simply because their bushes end up drying out of oil. So the cheaper ones don't have ball bearings, they just have like these so-called self-lubricating bushes that are basically soaked with oil, but then after a year, 2, 3, often that oil dries out or gets hard, and because the motor is not very powerful, it actually then gets stuck. So what one can do is take it apart and then simply oil the bushes or oil the shaft where it makes contact with the bushes. So that needs to be done both with the front bearing and the rear bearing. Many people will be able to do this themselves. It's relatively unsophisticated. I'll show you a couple of tips here how you can do this and what you've got to look out for. Obviously make sure that the machine is unplugged before you work on it, that you don't shock yourself. The first thing that is useful to do is to remove the front cover. That happens by normally taking out a couple of screws. Then when that front cover is off, you need to take the actual fan off the shaft. Now the way the fan is held onto the shaft is by means normally of some form of a little knob, and there's a catch there. Because of the direction of rotation of the fan, the shaft thread is normally a left hand thread, which means this nut actually works the opposite way around. It confuses me every time I do this. So what that basically means is to undo the plastic nut, you've got to go like this way around. And it does sometimes happen that these nuts are a little bit too tight on the shaft, and then you can't take it off by hand, in which case you need to use a plier such as this. Just make sure that it's gripped firmly, but not so firmly that you crack the plastic. And again, this is where you really have to remember that it's a left-hand thread, so that you don't end up trying to loosen it and it doesn't come off, and eventually you crack the nut simply because you're turning it the wrong way around. So remember, left-hand thread. Anyway, when you got that nut off, one can slide the fan off, and then the next thing to look out for is there's a little split pin that sits in a hole. It sort of goes all the way through to sort of form a T, which then slots into the fan slot. That needs to come out, and again a plier is useful for that. Also, a thing to look out for is the split pin is very often slightly tapered. In other words, it's got a slightly smaller diameter on the one side compared to the other side. One can also see that the slot here is a little bit wider than over here. So pull it out towards the bigger side so that it comes out like a tapered pin. Once that's out, what one can do next is to loosen all the screws that hold the shell together. When that's out, I find it works best to actually tap the shaft on this end. Make sure you tap it with a wooden block or mallet or something that you don't damage the thread. But as you tap it here, sort of this scenario will happen, and then you can grip it and you can take it apart like that. Then, as you can see, that comes out completely. And what I do then is I put a little bit of oil on the shaft here, and the same thing over here, and I just rub it in lightly like that and put it back together. like that. And then basically the assembly process is opposite around what we showed now. Also here to remember, there is an earth cable. This earth cable attaches onto here. What is quite a good idea is when you're taking things apart is to make photographs of the various stages of taking it apart. It's very useful that, for example, also then if you're not sure, you'll see where the earth goes back on. You'll also see where other wires goes back on, etc., etc. Yeah, in my experience, very often when you do that, the fan works perfectly again for another year or two or so. And then when that year or two is over, you can repeat the same thing and it will keep on working. Thank you very much for watching.